China just announced it is spending $295 billion to build data centers, not in a decade, over the next 5 years. That number is already being compared to everything. It is smaller than US big tech's annual spend. It is larger than most countries' defense budgets. And it tells you something about where this race is actually heading that the headlines are missing entirely. There are 3 things you need to understand about this plan. First, this is not a tech company announcement. Second, it is almost entirely locked out of American hardware. Third, it is designed to win a race that most people in the West are not watching. Each of those facts changes the story. And by the end of this video, all 3 will be resolved. Bloomberg reported this morning that Beijing is preparing to spend 2 trillion yuan, roughly $295 billion, over the next 5 years to build a nationwide network of interconnected computing hubs. Key government agencies, including the National Development and Reform Commission, are drafting the blueprint. State-owned carriers, China Mobile and China Telecom, will operate the bulk of the facilities. The goal is a unified compute network by 2028. And if that number sounds large to you, here is the context that immediately complicates it. Meta and Microsoft alone are expected to set aside roughly $725 billion for AI infrastructure this year alone. So is this a serious challenge to US dominance? Or is it a government spending announcement dressed up as a technological leap? The honest answer is, it is both, and that framing misses the most important part. The spend is real. The ambition is real. But the structural constraint built into this plan is also real, and it is not the budget. China's plan, as Bloomberg reported, is specifically designed to rely on local suppliers, including Huawei, for at least 80% of the technology required, including AI chips. That is not a footnote. That is the architecture of the entire program. Nvidia and AMD are being deliberately excluded, not because of price or performance, but because Beijing instructed Chinese tech companies to limit their use of foreign chips to overseas operations. Reuters reported that this guidance has been in place for some time. The result is a stalemate at customs. Nvidia received US licenses to sell H200 chips to China in early 2026. But the Financial Times reported that Beijing simultaneously pushed domestic firms toward Huawei hardware, leaving shipments in regulatory limbo. Nvidia halted H200 production for China and reallocated manufacturing capacity toward its next-generation hardware. The market closed before a sale was made. This is worth sitting with. The world's second-largest economy is deliberately constructing its AI infrastructure around a chip supplier that, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, currently produces roughly 4% of the aggregate AI computing power that Nvidia produces annually. That is not a gap. That is a chasm. And yet the plan is moving forward. Huawei is developing new manufacturing approaches, announcing what it calls logic folding techniques for advanced chip production. Morgan Stanley analysts estimated China's domestic AI chip suppliers could account for roughly $21 billion of their national market this year, with the market itself potentially reaching $67 billion by 2030. Here is where the infrastructure story gets more complicated than the headlines suggest. China has a structural advantage that has nothing to do with chips. Brookings researchers testified before the U.S. House Select Committee on Strategic Competition in April 2026 that China holds the upper hand at the energy layer of AI infrastructure. The Federal Reserve's own analysis found that China added 429 gigawatts of net electric generation capacity in 2024 alone, more than 15 times the net capacity added by the United States that same year. Fortune reported that Goldman Sachs estimated China will have roughly 400 gigawatts of spare power capacity by 2030, equal to 3 times what the entire world will need to meet data center demands. What does that actually mean on the ground? It means China can already greenlight data center clusters at a scale that US operators are currently told to wait years for. The hubs being planned in lower-cost inland regions like Inner Mongolia and Guizhou draw on coal and rapidly expanding renewable grids. When you combine cheap land, cheap power, and state-directed construction timelines, Al Jazeera reported that modular Huawei data centers can be built in 6 months, compared to at least a year for US equivalents. The per-query inference cost for Chinese AI applications runs substantially below what US operators carry. That is not an abstract geopolitical metric. That is a price per output advantage that compounds every year the energy gap persists. Meanwhile, Brookings noted that U.S. energy constraints caused a 50% quarter-on-quarter drop in new data center project approvals at the end of 2025. Advancing AI is now an electricity problem as much as a chip problem. China controls the input it has, and it is building around the input it does not. Before this becomes a job story, understand what the infrastructure advantage unlocks. It is not just data center construction. It is who gets to set the price of intelligence at scale, and who eventually has no choice but to pay it. China's own 5-year plan frames this $295 billion buildout as a job creation engine. Reuters reported in March 2026 that Beijing's parliamentary session went all in on AI, with Human Resources Minister Wang Xiaoping stating that China was working to leverage AI for 12.7 million university graduates entering the labor market this year. That figure is nearly 3 times the size of the entire U.S. graduating cohort. The government's position is that AI adoption creates more roles than it eliminates, particularly in sectors like the low-altitude economy, new energy vehicles, and generative AI services. Some analysts are skeptical. Alicia Garcia Herrero, chief Asia-Pacific economist at Natixis, told Reuters that automation pushes wages down and that youth unemployment will continue to rise. A Wired China analysis found that nearly half of workers surveyed in a study of 2,400 manufacturing employees in southern China believe their jobs could be automated within the next 5 to 10 years. China's Ministry of Human Resources announced in January 2026 that it would issue official documents addressing AI's impact on employment. That is a government beginning to hedge its own narrative. Here is what both sides are probably right about simultaneously. AI will generate new roles in the documented high-growth sectors the government is funding: drone logistics operators, generative AI trainers, new energy vehicle technicians. Those roles are real, and the pipeline funding them is real. But the displacement of mid-tier manufacturing and back-office work is also accelerating, and it is moving faster than retraining timelines can absorb. The net outcome is not zero. It is a decade of structural labor transition that Beijing is choosing to call a job story, because the alternative framing, mass displacement during an already stressed youth employment cycle, is politically untenable. That tension does not disappear because the infrastructure spend is large, which is exactly why the raw spending comparison has become the frame nobody is questioning. Most coverage reduced this to a single number and declared a verdict. That is the wrong way to read it. The number that matters is not the headline figure, it is what that figure actually buys inside China's supply chain. The $295 billion over 5 years versus $725 billion in a single year framing is real. The gap is real, but it is analytically incomplete. Brookings noted that Chinese data centers cost significantly less to build and operate than U.S. equivalents: cheaper labor, components, construction costs, and local government incentives. The purchasing power of that $295 billion inside China's supply chain is not the same as $295 billion spent in Northern Virginia. Now consider the chip constraint before closing that gap entirely. Yes, Huawei's current Ascend hardware trails Nvidia's in raw processing power and memory bandwidth. That is documented. But DeepSeek confirmed it used Huawei's 950PR chip for inference on its latest model, even though the model was trained on Nvidia hardware. Inference is where most of the deployed compute hours live. If domestic chips are sufficient for inference at scale, the gap that matters most in practical deployment terms narrows considerably. That said, Huawei's developer software ecosystem still lags Nvidia's CUDA platform by a significant margin in usability and maturity. Tom's Hardware reported that in May 2026, and Foreign Affairs noted in February 2026 that U.S. firms still control roughly 70% of global AI compute. The compute gap is not closing quickly. If you are tracking enterprise AI, autonomous systems, or humanoid robotics, the 2028 deadline is not an abstraction. It is the point at which 2 genuinely separate AI supply chains become fully operational. The models you use, the platforms those models run on, and the chips powering those platforms are all converging on a world where the answer depends on which side of this divide your provider sits on. A unified Chinese compute grid running Huawei hardware at inference scale means the AI tools built on that grid will be optimized for that ecosystem. Not CUDA, not US cloud architecture. Which supply chain your tools run on will not be a technical decision, it will be a political one. What actually changed today is the signal, not the sum. Return to the three things stated at the start. This is a state act, not a tech company bet. And that distinction determines how fast it moves regardless of quarterly earnings pressure. It is deliberately locked out of American hardware, and that is now the design, not a constraint Beijing is trying to escape. And it is competing in a race. Most Western analysts are still measuring with the wrong ruler, comparing a 5-year sovereign infrastructure commitment against a single year of private market capital deployment. A $295 billion state commitment built around domestic hardware, aimed at a unified national grid by 2028, is a declaration that China has stopped waiting for the export control environment to change. It is building an AI economy that functions without American chips. Whether that economy performs at the level of its US counterpart is a separate question. The bet is that it performs well enough, at a lower cost, at a reach that private capital cannot replicate through geography or political will alone. That is the race that is actually happening. Two different models, two different theories of control, one shared deadline that neither side negotiated. Drop your read in the comments. Are you watching the chip gap or the energy gap? Because those are two different races, and the one the market is not pricing runs on electricity, not silicon. Facts over fear.